There was about a decade there where I couldn't write, and it wasn't writer's block. I know what that feels like. I got over that early in my career because, I couldn't say to the editor, I just don't feel it today because he's going, there's a 3:00 deadline. I don't care. But so I knew how to overcome writer's block. It felt more like just the well going dry. And it was probably exhaustion. Eventually, as I started work on The Way of the Three-Year-Old Why, and it was like the well filling up again, I had thought I wasn't writing because I was depressed. Turns out I was depressed because I wasn't writing.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 358 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. In today's episode, I have an interview with Donn King. Donn King is the confidence cultivator, a professor, pastor, speaker, and author who lives in the mountains of East Tennessee. He also hosts the Realignment Show, a podcast to support listeners in living their values so they can value your life. He's also the author of two books, The Way of the Three-Year-Old Why, and more recently released in the Sparklight Chronicles, Medium Well, which just came out in early 2024. And my interview with Donn is coming up later in this episode, but first, let's hear a word about this episode's sponsor.
Ready to elevate your writing career? Join the Cruising Writers Group Sailing the Caribbean from Galveston on February 22nd to March 1st, 2025. This time, we're focused on indie authors, with special guests Mark Leslie and Aaron Wright leading a deep dive into the world of self-publishing. You'll come away with invaluable insights, but also great memories as you connect with other writers and explore charming ports of call in Roatan, Honduras, Costa Maya, Mexico, and Cozumel. Visit cruisingwriters.com to book your spot today.
And now for some comments from recent episodes. So for episode 357, Donn King said, so sorry to hear you under the weather again, but glad you are at least feeling better. I was interested to hear the material you shared from both Maya Angelou and Toni Morrison. I had the privilege of hearing Dr. Angelou speak at the Tennessee Theater in Knoxville, Tennessee on September 19th, 2005, and I only know the date because I looked up her appearance. During that talk, among other things, she talked about, as a young girl, being the recipient of abuse horrific enough that she didn't talk for a number of years. She said she later forgave the perpetrator, a relative, if I remember correctly. She said she didn't do it for his sake, but for her own. She said she could only do so because of a realization strikingly similar to the quote you mentioned. If he'd have known better, he'd have done better. Amazing person. And Donn, thank you so much for sharing that anecdote and, that amazing person, Dr. Angelou, and that thought, and even sort of some of the perspective behind the know better, do better, as well. And I also reflect on she forgave him for her own sake. I was going to speak to a lot of the intrinsic stuff that we talk about later in this episode, and you're going to hear directly from Donn later in this episode. So thank you for that, sharing that, Donn, on the comments. Also, on episode 357, Beth says in the comments, do you have written guidelines for submitting a podcast guest request to you? And that's a great question, Beth. I actually don't have any official guidelines, but here is what I'm looking for. Ideally, it's an interview that can bring some sort of insight, perspective, experience, or ideas that would ultimately be useful for writers who are the main audience for this podcast. And so if you want to pitch an idea, you can email me or just go to my website, markleslie.ca, and there's a contact form. You can fill out the details there. And again, I'm not looking to just have an author on to talk about their book, because this is not a podcast for readers. I'm looking to have authors on that I can talk to who can share some of their experiences that I can then reflect on and learn from their experiences, and ideally my readers learn from those experiences as well. Over on the Twitter sphere, Edwin Downward said, in a conversation we had about the episode with Thorn Coyle and the mid-list indie author mindset, the Kickstarter's still going on. I'll have a link to that in the show notes. And Edwin said, I admit to regularly shaking my head at comments where authors moan about only making amounts of money that would have me popping a bottle of champagne, though I often wonder what their net is after ad spend. Two great reflections there, Edwin. It is so true. I mean, I think what happens is when authors get to a certain point, they just want to get to the next level and the next level. And there's so much out there where you have authors who are sharing how well they are doing. But there's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, I would argue, authors who, would kill to get even half of what they're getting. And because we only hold up and spotlight those 5 and 6 and 7 figure authors, a lot of us feel, oh, I must be the loser who's not making that kind of money. But the reality is most people are not making any kind of money. To be quite honest, if you crack $500 in a year, you're already ahead of the game compared to the stats that I have seen from most books that are published that do not sell at all. So if you are even cracking, 2 figures a month and, 3 figures, you're doing remarkably well. And I'm not saying don't keep reaching and don't keep trying. It really breaks my heart when authors are disheartened because they feel they're not good enough and they're probably doing better than they think they are. That's right. You, dear listener, you're already doing better than you think you are. So I want you to have some more faith in yourself. So thank you for that comment, Edwin. And other Twitter comments that are not related to an episode, but related to something else that I wrote, which was an article I wrote for the BookBub blog, 10 tips for growing a wide global audience. Folks like Carolyn and so many others, Carolyn V. Hamilton, and Aurora Springer are two of the names that come up, quoted from the article that success in wide publishing isn't about reaching the widest possible audience. It's about understanding your audience in as narrow a manner as possible. And because this podcast is all about helping writers, if you haven't seen the article, I will have a link to that article, 10 Tips for Growing a Wide Global Audience. If you want to leave comments for the show, go ahead and leave them over at starkreflections.ca for any episode. You can also email me, mark@markleslie.ca. Okay, so in terms of a personal update, you can probably hear it in my voice. I've still got something, and I don't know what it is. It's a new something. I started to pick it up just before I headed off to LA last week, and I know it's a combination of allergies, seasonal allergies that always affect me this time of year, especially with a cough, but it obviously was more than allergies, and I thought it was just my allergies going really bad, because when I got to LA, it got even worse, and I did everything I could to keep going. Managed to stick it out for the week, lots of medication, stuff like that. By the time I got back in the wee hours of Saturday morning. I was feeling so poorly, I could barely breathe. I was actually this is where I knew there was something really wrong. Walking, not just a flight of stairs, but walking in general, I had to do it really slow, and I was having trouble breathing. So I went in to a walk-in clinic on Saturday, and after they heard my breath with a stethoscope, they started treating me for pneumonia and sent me off for an x-ray. Believe it or not, I know my doctor got the results of the x-ray already, and I haven't heard back, so maybe it's fine. But they started treating me for pneumonia, gave me some antibiotics, and gave me 2 different inhalers that I've been taking multiple times a day, which is helping. And I am feeling 1,000 times better than I was Saturday, Sunday, Monday. I was barely, napping in the afternoon and everything, but I've got so much of my energy back, which is great. My voice is almost back to normal, but I am feeling loads better. And that's good because I'm going to be at the Toronto independent author conference this weekend of May 4th, 5th, or 5th, 6th, 7th, whatever that is. I'm looking at the wrong calendar. Probably the 4th, the 5th, the 6th. And that's going to be in Toronto. And I did have Dao Wong, who's the organizer of that. I had him on a previous podcast. There'll be a link to that in the show notes. But just a little something about Writers of the Future. It was a fantastic week in LA with so many great writers. And I did talk with them, got to hang out with them in the evening, stuff like that. Just absolutely amazing. And I am so honored to be a judge for Writers of the Future. But more than that, I'm honored to be able to help and guide and support and prop up and answer questions for other writers. And I think that leads quite remarkably and beautifully into Donn King, my guest, and when he asks us to look at what's important to you. And that is so important to me. Helping other writers, I realize, is critical. And yes, this podcast and the things I do to support other writers takes away from my writing. And I love writing so much, but I also love helping people. I love helping other writers. And one of the main reasons I do this podcast and do so much like the work I do with Writers of the Future is I want to support and prop up and help other writers. That is so incredibly valuable and important to me. And that's one of my priorities, which is one of the reasons why I'm doing it. So again, I love the fact that I get to do this, in an official capacity with Writers of the Future. I just love that the whole week is about propping up and supporting writers. And so I'm still running on a little bit of a high from interacting with so many amazing people and having that privilege and that opportunity. But without further ado, why don't we roll the bumper and get on to this interview with Donn King. Hey, Donn, welcome to the Stark Reflections podcast.
Thank you, Mark. It's so great to be on here with you. I've been looking forward to this.
Well, it's great to chat with a fellow author and a fellow podcaster. But before we get into that, let's give my listeners a bit of a background in terms of what I'm most curious about is your creative life. When did that all start for you, and how did you know you wanted to be a writer?
Well, I know you hear all the time, I've been writing since I could hold the pencil, and then there are those others who started writing in their 30s. It's kind of a hard question for me to answer in a way. I started work at a newspaper when I was 14 years old.
Okay.
But prior to that, I wasn't much of a student until 6th grade. And I think one of the ways you and I connected, I wrote something on your, was it on your Patreon? It's where I was talking about my experience with a library.
Yes, that's what it was. Yeah.
And so for folks who hadn't read that, I was in 6th grade or something and had been reading because they made me read, like most of us. But I discovered, here's the short version, I discovered science fiction at the library, and the idea that you could have fun reading and nobody made you just opened up the whole world for me. I still remember that first book. It was Robert A. Heinlein, Have Spacesuit Will Travel.
Oh, classic. Oh,
yes,
my God. Yes.
Absolutely. And then Podkane of Mars and Red Planet, and then Isaac Asimov, and it went out from there. So I tried my hand at writing I guess you'd call it a short story. I didn't know the terminology then.
Right.
Handwriting in a 3-ring binder notebook with a pencil.
Right.
And I remember I got my characters into some situation. I couldn't figure out how to get them out of it. And so I wrote, and then the rocket exploded. The end.
The end. Yep.
Yes. So I guess technically that was my first foray into it. I suppose. Oh my! And then it's just as I said, I started working in a newspaper when I was 14. And
so working on a newspaper, were you actually working at the newspaper and in some sort of capacity writing? Or I mean, most people at 14 are delivering papers.
Well, in a way, that's why I said it was hard to answer, because it wasn't one day this happened kind of thing. It was gradual. And I want to do the short version because I respect the time here. My 8th grade history teacher was the sponsor of the school newspaper. He needed
Okay.
a photographer. He stuck his head out the door of the classroom, and I happened to be the kid in the hallway. And he pulled me in. So I was on the sidelines at football games shooting for the school newspaper,
Yeah.
and the newspaper editor was there. So I saw him every week.
Okay.
He said, "We've got an old dark room that we never use. You want to come down to the newspaper and just experiment?" And of
Whoa.
course, I picked up
Huh.
on it. And as I hung around the newspaper office, I would write cut lines for
Okay.
free, because
Yeah.
he would just let me use the darkroom. Again, longer story shorter, he began letting me write obituaries and things like that. And then I needed to make some money, so I got a job driving a delivery truck for dry cleaners. And the editor, whose name was Charles Dawson, Charles said, "Well, if you're going to go somewhere for pay, we'll pay you." And
Wow.
that's what kind of sucked me in. So people couldn't do that these days because of labor regulations, but they got free labor from me for about a year. But I consider it a very good deal because I got to see firsthand how the sausage is made, so to
Yeah,
speak.
no kidding. Or unmade in the case of obituaries.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Excellent.
No, I found that parallel interesting that your very first short story, boom, the spaceship blew up and it was all over.
I
And then
guess
you
it
went
was,
on to write obituaries for
yeah,
some.
setting the stage there. I hadn't even thought about that.
So, one of the things, and I'm sure anyone listening to this is going to pick up on this right away, is you're a natural born storyteller. You've got some great skills in that, and I want to get to parable books
Mhm.
in terms of what you write. So you've got the Way of the 3-Year-Old Why and Medium Well. Now those are business parable books.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that choice as a medium for telling stories?
And in a way, I think it's just like I slid into the newspaper business. I'm sliding into the kind of writing that I want to do.
Okay.
When I was working at the newspaper, I saw that there were two kinds of people there. There were people who loved the language, who really wanted to be novelists, and they were working at the paper to make a
Okay.
living. And then there were those people who liked digging and discovering things, and to them, the writing was just a means to an end.
Okay.
So the parable thing, I've always been a nonfiction writer most of my life. Wanted to write fiction, but there was always that, and then the rocket exploded thing
Yeah.
hanging over my head. So I was fortunate to get to know a writer by the name of Bob Burg. Bob wrote a 1,000,000 copy bestseller co-authored with John David Mann called The Go-Giver, and it is a business parable.
Yeah.
I've known Bob for 20, 25 years, but I didn't realize that the Bob Burg that I knew was the same Bob Burg as this massive author.
Yeah.
And so some years back, I connected back into his community. He talked a lot about why business parables, and I thought that sounds to me like a bridge from nonfiction into fiction.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, what I didn't know, and I can't remember this, Mark, from hearing you over the years, have you been a gamer? So World of Warcraft, you played World of Warcraft?
My gaming experience goes prior to the internet, early early
Okay, yeah, yeah.
internet days. So World of Warcraft is very new and advanced for someone like me.
And I understand what you mean there, but you probably ran into what they would call the Holy Trinity. There's damage dealers, there's healers, and there's
Yeah.
tanks. Couldn't think for just a second.
Yeah.
So within that world, there are these characters that they call hybrids. That they can perform more than one function,
Yeah.
but they will never do it at more than about 80% of what a pure class will. Like
Right.
a druid in World of Warcraft can heal, but will never be able to heal as well as a priest.
Yeah.
Okay. That's context for saying when I started playing World of Warcraft years ago, because I needed to stay awake taking care of my daughter in the hospital, I chose a druid because they could go invisible. What I
Oh,
didn't know was that a druid is the hardest class to play in World of
oh,
Warcraft. I didn't know that. And so I didn't know when I started writing business parables that they combine skill sets of nonfiction and fiction.
Yeah.
I thought it was a bridge, you see, and it
Yeah.
turns out you've got to tell a good story. So you need to know characterization and scene setting and plot and all of that kind of thing. But you also will be teaching principles or lessons or insights. And if those are awkwardly layered on top of a story, then it's just bad writing. So I set myself up for a challenge, and I didn't really realize I was doing that.
So that was one of the things you learned about writing parable. What are some of the things, examples, and don't give any spoilers away, but
Yeah.
examples of things that you relay in a parable? And I guess what I'm trying to get at is relaying it in a parable versus bullet point, here are your things you should know. Obviously,
Exactly.
there's perks, benefits to one over the other, right?
Well, yes, and it's always an open question. I mentioned Bob Burg, another one of my friends who writes business parables, is Jeff West. And Jeff and I have had this conversation about, do you start with the principles and then create a story to go with it? Or do you start with the story and then extract the principles?
Right, right.
And I've had experiences on both sides. Where the 3-Year-Old Why started from a keynote speech. And I know you are a speaker, a member of CAPS, Canadian Association of Professional Speakers. You understand this structure. One of my signature speeches was The Way of the 3-Year-Old Why. And so it's 5 principles, and those principles are out there, so there's no spoiler with the principles, but these are things like look for the aha, look for the emotion, look for the so that illustration of that one. We always hear the joke, why did the chicken cross the road to get to the other side? Well, why do you want to get to the other side? Has he got hungry chickens? Is Colonel Sanders chasing him? What's the so that?
Yeah, yeah.
Started with those principles and then thought, what would be a story that I could use to form a context for that?
Right, right.
And it be an engaging story, because we're not going to name names on this one, but there are those business parables out there that the fiction aspect is wooden, characters are thin, the
Yeah.
plot, nobody really cares, and so that was the challenge in this one. A semi-spoiler, The Way of the 3-Year-Old Why is not autobiographical, but I do draw heavily on
Yeah,
out
yeah.
world stuff.
I was gonna ask about that.
Yeah, yeah. So, I really am, people who are hearing this audio only, they can't see how old I am, but I'm on the verge of retirement from a day job. I've taught college for over 40 years. Dan Roberts is the focal character in Way of the 3-Year-Old Why. He's a college professor, although we don't make a big deal about that.
A very handsome college professor with a mustache.
Indeed.
Yeah, yeah, of course, yeah.
I should show you my reference picture, although I can't get to it real quickly. He's about 20 years younger than me.
Okay, all right. Looks a lot like a 20-year younger you.
Yes, yes. Oh my. In any case, the similarities are, Dan was trying to build a speaking business. I was trying to build a speaking business. Dan has a disabled daughter. I have a disabled daughter. Her constantly going in the hospital made it practically impossible for me to schedule dependably, and so I quit trying to market. Dan did the same thing. Some of what's in there in the story may be things that I wish that I had had. There was no wise guide, as shows up in The Way of the 3-Year-Old Why.
Yeah.
Nobody was leaving me mysterious notes. There are some things that I changed. My wife actually is in a power wheelchair. Her craft is crochet, whereas I made Grace's craft to be pictures, paintings. Although there is a picture referenced in the book that is based on a picture she actually took in Cage Cove, Tennessee.
Okay.
So there's a lot of parallel, and yet I couldn't say it's autobiographical.
Yeah, yeah. It's drawn like a lot of fiction is drawn from real elements. Yeah.
And I left out a lot. I mean, my other kids may be miffed because they're not mentioned. I don't know.
Yeah, come on, Dad. What? So you talked about having a severely disabled daughter, and one of the things that, lots of people are caretakers, but how does that impact you? I mean, we know a little bit about speaking, but how does that impact you as a writer?
For years, I thought it impacted me by keeping me from writing. I mean, although it is true that I started writing over 50 years ago, there was about a decade there where I couldn't write, and it wasn't writer's block. I know what that feels like.
Okay.
I got over that early in my career because, I couldn't say to the editor, I just don't feel it today because he's going, there's a 3 o'clock deadline. I don't care.
Yeah, yeah.
But so I knew how to overcome writer's block. It felt more like just the well going dry. And it was probably exhaustion, because it was before my daughter qualified for nursing care. So we were taking care of her 24/7. She has to have somebody with her all the time,
Right.
168 hours a week. We were having to do that ourselves.
Yeah.
And I would try to write and just nothing would come. So this went on for about a decade.
Wow.
And I find myself saying a lot of times here, Mark, and I'm going to make a longer story shorter. This is one of those times. Eventually, as I started work on The Way of the Three-Year-Old Why, and it was like the well filling up again, I had thought I wasn't writing because I was depressed. Turns out I was depressed because I wasn't writing.
Ooh.
And I
Okay.
put that, I don't know if you've come across it yet or not, I put that phrase in Dan Roberts' mouth in the book. But it was certainly true for me. And I don't want to suggest for those out there struggling with mental health that all you have to do is write. I think the underlying principle is that at least some depression comes from denying an essential part of who you are.
Mhm.
I need to write.
Yeah. That feels so true for me because I do know, and again, I rediscover this again and again in those times when I don't allow myself the, I don't know, maybe writing is therapy for me in many ways, but I do, when I don't allow myself the privilege of being able to express myself in that way, I guess, even if it's myself and it's not going anywhere, but
Well,
private
yeah.
writing.
And it's so easy to say, I'll do that next week. Because,
Yeah,
I have some sense of how busy you are. My God, all the business stuff and the graduate stuff that you're doing, the travel, the speaking. I can see where it'd be really easy to say, well, not today.
yeah. There's nothing like putting up a pre-order or having a date with an editor deadline to,
Yeah, yeah.
to get you motivated, right? Because again, it's not all that different than the newspapers. Like, no, 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 we need that at 3 o'clock. You
Yes.
can't just feel. I don't feel like doing this surgery. Like other professions don't have that luxury of procrastinating the way we do as writers.
Indeed. I remember an editor one time, me saying something like, I don't really feel up to it today. And he said, well, get it done or you're fired. And I got it done. And he said, so you feel better now? I said, well, you never explained it so clearly. You know,
I love that. So you talked about something that's being authentic, and that leads to a question I wanted to ask you about your podcast, The Alignment Show, because so the goal of the show is to support listeners in living their values, and that seems to align nicely with what you talked about, with what works for you as a writer, right?
right, right. And again, I'm not sure which came first. It's what I think if I got it culturally accurate, it's what our Asian friends would call mutually arising.
Oh,
And
okay,
so it's not so much this caused that or that caused that. They just kind of came up together.
okay,
That has been a growing thing with me in teaching college because students are always trying to figure out what do I want to do with my life.
right, yeah,
And I think the pandemic accelerated it. It didn't cause it, but I think as people figured out life is short, you don't want to spend it doing stuff you don't want to do.
yeah.
That's where the so-called Great Resignation came from, I think. I call it the Great Realignment because I have a friend, I'll mention her name here, Alexandra Watkins. She is known for her ability, not just as a marketer, but for helping people name their businesses, their concepts. She's the one who came up with the Baconator for Wendy's, for example.
Wow.
And she's been on my podcast. And
Okay.
so she is one who, instead of quitting what she was doing, she had started getting a little burned out on it, a little bored with it after 18 years. The pandemic took away a lot of her business, like it did for a lot of speakers.
Yeah.
And so she had time to think about it. She remembered what it was that she really loved about what she's doing.
Okay.
And so she came back renewed. She's just doing great guns these days.
Oh, wow.
So I think that's a lot of that alignment thing, is that it forced people to take a step back and to say, what really is important to me, which is all that the word values means. What do you value? What do you find important?
So for the Alignment show, we talked about Alexandra
Watkins.
Yeah, so we talked about her as a speaker like yourself. Who do you have normally? Is it people from all walks of life that come on the Alignment
All
show?
walks of life. All walks of life. I had a gentleman on 3 or 4 weeks ago who grew up in a mortuary funeral home. His parents owned a funeral home. School principal. Now, he was on the show because he'd written a book about the experience.
Yeah, yeah.
And I do get a lot of writers, a lot of speakers on the show, I think, just because people like us have gone through that whole thing of,
Right.
why do I want to do this? What's important to me? I don't know anybody who, as a teenager, said, I want to be a professional speaker. We're speaking about something, and so
Yeah.
the nature of that leads people to introspection.
Yeah.
But I haven't been able to get him on. I had somebody scheduled and we had to reschedule. He is a former nurse who is now a death row chaplain. And he has no business to promote. He's not trying to move a book
Yeah.
to get gigs. He was just a fascinating person about what led you to make that change.
Wow, a death row chaplain. Because I mean, that's
intense.
Okay, being a nurse has its highs and lows, but being a death row chaplain, not going to have a lot of highs, right? I mean, you're there when people need you, desperately need you, need somebody, need some force,
Yes.
and they're I can't wait to hear that interview, because that sounds like
I
it's
hope
going to
I
be
can get him on. I
fascinating.
haven't been able to reschedule him. He's sadly enough, he's too busy.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's yeah.
I do know his story is that his brother was on death row. I don't know what the outcome of that was.
Right. Okay.
But that's what
Wow.
led him into it. And I'll tell you honestly, the main reason I have a podcast is it gives me an excuse to have conversations with people I otherwise wouldn't get to have a conversation with.
You and me both, my
Like
friend.
today. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you and me both, because it is really, I mean, it's an opportunity for me to learn. And while I'm learning, I may as well record it and let other people learn too, right?
Indeed. That's the way to look at it.
Yeah, yeah, but it is a wonderful excuse to convince people that they want to talk to you. I don't have to be charming. I just have to have something to give them. Right?
Exactly. I mean, in a way, that's what we do as writers, right?
Yeah, yeah, that is true. That is true. We're providing something for that audience. So that is fascinating. So I want to go back to the books for a second. So you talked about Well a number of times, and I have not looked yet at. So you've got the Sparklight Chronicles, The Way of the 3-Year-Old Wise, the first book, which I'm reading right now. Medium Well is the second book, and you talk about there's going to be a third book. But is the Well in Medium Well the Well I'm thinking of when you've mentioned the Well?
I hadn't even thought about that
Oh.
connection.
Or is it the way that we prefer, cooking meat or something like that?
It's the title. I did have some early readers who thought the title might not be good because of that potential confusion, but it just fits the storyline so well. So the very brief version of that is there's a young woman who discovers that she has the ability, not like a medium or a psychic, to talk to dead people, but to talk to people like my daughter who cannot communicate verbally.
Oh, medium.
So that's the medium part. Okay.
Oh.
And the well part is, this is kind of inconvenient for her. She has her own mental health issues. She's afraid that she's imagining this, that she's crazy. And it's a little bit of a spoiler what I just gave, but it's revealed in the first scene. so it's
Right,
not much
right.
of a spoiler.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
the medium well is the well part is about taking care of yourself when you don't know what's
Ah,
going on,
okay.
But the medium part, and I have a friend who is she calls herself, I think, an intuitive psychic.
Yeah, yeah.
And right there in the title, you see, I've got an error because technically this would be a psychic. The medium would be somebody who's talking to dead people.
Yeah, but the intuitive, I think, layers a couple different things. You can be intuitive in the way that you can pick up on
Mhm.
when you're talking to somebody else, you can pick up on the very subtle nuances, right? Imagine, there are people on the spectrum that may not be able to pick up on social nuances and stuff like that. But then there's probably people who are very intuitive and can pick up on stuff that nobody else can see, kind of like a wine connoisseur who can pick up on stuff, right? But then I would
Exactly.
even imagine that the intuition, because I do write, I do research for paranormal activities and things like that, that there are people who are sensitive to things beyond our regular understanding in some ways too.
Absolutely. In
So
fact, one of
intuitive
my
psychic makes sense to me.
well, and yeah, but psychic well doesn't work well for a title, you see, and
No,
so
no, no. But medium well is it's a beautiful play on words
yeah,
because
yeah, and
again, the title prompts the question, "Ooh, what is this?"
what is this about? And to honor the to honor my friend, not only her, but people who would look at it and say, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. We actually have a little short conversation between Sky Jackson, who's the main character, and her mentor, Irene, where she makes a joke about being a medium.
Right.
And we have Irene say, well, actually, honey, it's psychic, but you're getting used to this. Yeah. And so it's like a little tiny writing craft thing to provide that bridge.
Yeah, it's also very meta.
Yeah.
I love that. Well, and so I want to talk about. I'm curious. We'll find out the title of the third book, but so medium well is something that inspires inquiry as to
Yes,
what this is. The Way of the Three-Year-Old Why. So when I first saw the title, I was thinking about Simon Sinek, Know Your Why.
exactly.
And then I was thinking about but the 3-year-old why may not be a why that's 3 years old. But I was thinking when I first saw it of a 3-year-old, and they ask why about everything.
Yes,
They're beautifully inquisitive, and so
exactly.
there seems to be a play on words there too, right?
Exactly. And it is literally asking the way a 3-year-old would, in the sense that they're not going to settle for the surface answer.
Yeah, I love
Um,
that.
yeah.
Why
There,
is the
there's
sky blue? Yeah,
yeah, exactly. I
yeah,
mean, Calvin and Hobbes, there was a running joke about that kind of thing, and
yeah.
there's actually a technique in Japanese management, I guess I would say theory or practice, called the 5 whys. The idea being to keep asking, but 5 is very often not enough because you can still stay on the surface.
Wow.
It's like, okay, why do you want to be a professional speaker? Well, I want to make a lot of money. Well, why do you want to make a lot of money? Because I want to buy a good house. Why do you want to buy a good house? If I keep going with that, I may eventually get to the place of I've got a severely disabled daughter and a partially disabled wife, and I need to have a secure place to take care of them.
Right, right.
And I just got to one of the 5 principles is look for the emotion. Without emotion, there is no motion. Emotion is that which moves us.
Right. Yeah.
And I think a 3-year-old will keep asking that, why is the sky blue, until they get the sense that you're giving an answer that means something to you.
Right. Okay. I like that. I like that. That is fantastic. So, what then is the third book that you have planned for this 3-book series?
Funny enough, it was supposed to be the second one. The name of the book is Real Speak.
Okay.
I'm about a third of the way through writing that one. But even though I was about a third of the way writing that one,
Okay.
Medium Well suddenly popped up and insisted on being written first.
Yeah. I love when books do that. It's like, no, 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 step aside, Junior. I've got this. I've got
Exactly.
this one. Yeah.
So I am having to do a little fixing, to kind of fix the timeline. There are characters that are common to all 3.
Right. Okay.
So I got to make sure that it fits that way. But
Oh, okay. And the part of that same universe.
yes,
which is really cool. So I'm curious then. So you talked about you had a
Yeah.
signature talk, the three-year-old, the way of the 3-year-old why, and then you adapted that into a book.
Mhm.
How does that readapt now that the book is out? And like, do you change that talk? How does that change now that there's a different pre-existing format? Because I'm sure that, like most speakers, you have a talk that's sort of out of the box, but it's never really out of the box. You usually adapt it and mold it to the time frame, to the client, to the specific situation. And I think knowing the why of your client, why am I speaking? What do you want me to do? Those are
Mhm.
usually elements that get added. So you take it out of the box and go, okay, how am I going to reshape this? How's that been reshaped since the book's come out?
There are three quick answers to that. One is now I can reference the book.
Okay, perfect. Yes, you couldn't do that before. Yeah.
Right, right. And as you know, as being a speaker, when your primary work is as a speaker, they will tell you, write a book because it will help you to market your speaking. And when you're a writer, they will tell you, speak because it's going to help you market your writing.
Yeah.
When I was in the National Speakers Association some years ago, which is the American equivalent of CAPS, I don't know if they still do this or not, but they used to say, don't think of yourself as a speaker or a writer. Think of yourself as an expert in whatever, who
Yeah.
will use speaking and writing in courses and blogs and, whatever means to get your message out there.
Right, right.
So the two kind of support each other. A second way that it has changed it does change the adaptation. I learned from Craig Valentine, who is a professional speaker who helps other speakers be better. Um, he talks about having like 5 signature speeches. They're all then adapted to the audience that you're with. About 80% of the speech will be the same. The other 20% comes from talking with the client ahead of time, finding out their needs, finding out where the real fit is. And so, of course, that hasn't changed, but having the book out there can change what the client already knows.
Right. Especially if they've read it prior to, is like, yeah, we've all read the book. Now we're going to have Donn King come and talk to us.
Right,
So
right.
you obviously you're going to want to adapt it. So it's like, yeah,
Right, right.
yeah,
So
I
that's
got
the
that.
second thing. The
Yeah.
third thing is, and this is my overarching reality, I suppose. Um, Part of what I'm doing is going back to my writing roots. I am de-emphasizing the speaking. It's getting to where it's hard to schedule me because
Right. Yeah.
I never know. We have great nurses. I'm doing this now because we have a fantastic nurse that is in there with her. But there is a nursing shortage. I'm sure I don't know if that's the case in Canada or not. It's exacerbated in this country, the USA, and in Tennessee in particular. This is as political as I'm going to get because of bureaucratic, idiotic red tape BS. That stands for blowing smoke, by the way.
Oh yeah, yeah, of course.
Yeah, yeah. Um,
It's very family friendly.
yes, and so at any moment, there's been several times where a nurse was supposed to come on at 7 p.m. and at 7:15 p.m. still hasn't shown up. And then we get a call from the agency that she's had a flat tire or she's sick or whatever. And with no notice, I have to step in
Yeah, of
because my
course.
wife is partially disabled. She can't really take part in care.
Yeah, yeah.
That does not make me dependable as a speaker. Now, during the pandemic, I could still hop on Zoom.
Yeah, yeah.
It kind of put me on a level playing field. But now that live events are coming back, I'm wanting to go to Author Nation in November, for example. I am hesitant to get the ticket.
Yeah, of
And
course.
I know their refund policy. That's kind of beside
Yeah.
the point right now. I don't know whether I can travel. And this will sound a little morbid, but I want to keep my hand in with that industry because if and when anything happens with my daughter, I will need to stay busy.
Yeah.
So she has a very rare chromosomal disorder. There's only 15 to 20 like her known in the world at any given time.
Wow.
And so there is no medical database to provide a basis for prediction.
Right, right.
And we have no idea. And as a side note here, because I know a lot of your listeners deal with not only caregiving, but uncertainty, people will say to me, how do you as parents deal with that uncertainty? And my response has been, none of us have any certainty. We live with the illusion of predictability,
Yeah,
and we have literally been disillusioned.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
we don't know. And so you can't just sit down and wait for it to pass. But
Right.
I am, yeah, again, as I said, it sounds a little morbid, but I hope she lives another 50, 80 years. I hope she outlives me. But if she doesn't, I'm going to need to work.
Yeah, of course, of course. That makes complete sense. Um, so you've already offered some great advice to my listeners and to other writers out there. But I want to go back and if there are listeners that you would love to relay any sort of advice, whether it's writing, whether it's speaking, whether it's just general life advice, what is it something you'd love to say to either a young writer or a budding writer?
Oh my. That is such a great question. There's so many possibilities there. One of the things that I have practiced as a speaker, and I think it has served me well as a writer as well. In fact, this is kind of my label for myself is the confidence cultivator. And the idea of cultivation, none of us really have that naturally. The saying that has helped me is connection before content. It doesn't mean the content doesn't matter. It means that without the connection, the content won't matter.
Oh, that. I just got goosebumps.
Hmm.
I just got goosebumps. That is so true. It's so true in writing. It's so true in life.
Yes,
In
absolutely.
so many interactions that we have. Don, I look forward to having you back on the podcast because it's been such a great time chatting with you. But in the meantime, can you please let my listeners know where they can find about more about you, your books, and your podcast, all the things?
Absolutely. I appreciate that, Mark. The easiest way is probably my website, which is donking.com. I'll do like our friend Joe Penn does. That's DONN. That's Don with a double N.
Yes.
DONNKING.com. And from donking.com/ the number 3 and the letters YO, you can go directly to some material about the way of the 3-year-old why. DonnKing.com/medium well will take you to information about that book. I am using a lot of Draft to Digital's free tool, books2read.com. And so I really want to put that out there for folks. Books to read, it's books, the number 2, read.com/Donn King. That's Don with a double N.
That's the show. Sorry, I'm just filling in with Joanna's voice right now in my head.
Exactly. You can't help but hear that. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Don, I'll make sure all those links appear in the show notes at starkreflections.ca.
And
Oh,
I should also mention for the podcast
oh
that
yeah,
is,
the podcast, of course. Yeah.
I almost forgot about that. That is Confidence Cultivators, plural, confidencecultivators.com.
Okay.
And there will be a link there for podcast. And this coming Friday, as we record this, I'm sure this episode will come out after that. I have this fantastic guest coming up. His name is Mark Leslie Lefebvre.
Oh my goodness. I hope he is, if he's like 1/10 great guest that you were, it's going to be a great show.
Fantastic
And
conversation.
I'll have a link to that in the show notes and a link to all the things you talked about in the show notes at starkreflections.ca. Don, thanks again for hanging out with me today.
Thank you, Mark. It's been great. I appreciate it so much.
Okay, just a few things to reflect on. When I interviewed Don, the second book in his series, in the Sparklight Chronicles, was not yet out, but Medium Well is now out. Woohoo! So there'll be links to Don's books, donking.com/books, as well, so you can check out those awesome books. Now, a few things I want to reflect on in stuff that Don said was when he said, I wasn't writing because I was depressed because I wasn't writing. And when I listen back to that, I just remember how that makes me feel because, again, I'm not a mental health expert and I'm not disputing the stuff that can happen, the darkness that can really take over. But from my own experience, I do get into a really dark funk when I'm not writing. And I know it's a different kind of dark funk, but for me, I get satisfaction in the process of actually writing on a regular basis. When I have an active project in play, and the first thing I do, of course, after feeding the two cats and the dog, and putting the coffee on, and checking my blood pressure, taking my blood pressure medication, the first thing after I do all those things is I schedule that time for writing. And that is among the most satisfying parts of my day. And I am probably an easier person to be around when I'm in the throes of writing, because I'm really in my element. Even when the writing is frustrating, even when it's hard, I love it so much. And so when Donn said that, it reminds me that I kind of need to write. Writing is my therapy, my ongoing therapy. And I know it's not a replacement for actual therapy with actual therapists, but the truth is, so much of my writing is therapeutic. And of course, I recognize that Only Monsters in the Building with Michael going to therapy. I mean, that was therapy on top of therapy, because the writing itself was very therapeutic in so many ways, because maybe some of the issues Michael's dealing with are similar to issues that I find myself struggling with. But I mean, except for the lycanthropy, because, well, even if I did turn into a wolf, I wasn't going to tell you, because I don't want to be captured and studied in a lab. I mean, who does? Anyways, another reflection on when Donn asks, what really brings value? What's really important? And I know I talked about this a little bit in the opening for the show, but what's really important to me, I mean, apart from the family and loved ones and friends, I mean, really, those things are important to me, and I cherish them. But outside of, family and friends and loved ones, is writing is really important to me. The process itself, the act itself, the practice of writing is just so valuable. Reading is up there too for me. I absolutely love reading so much. But the other thing that brings me value, and which takes a lot of my time, is helping other writers. I get an intrinsic reward from it, just by offering my help. And yeah, I know I do have to, I've been told many times I have to charge more, I should charge more, but I really still want to always do that free 20-minute consult for people who can't afford it. I want to be able to help them. I want them to be able to have someone that can answer their questions honestly and honestly try to help them and support them and prop them up. That brings me great value, and it's really important. The final thing is Donn's connection before content. I mean, that's good writing advice, right? You put a protagonist in a precarious situation, and you want to actually care for them. You want to have that connection before the content, before the drama, etc. as well. And that's great life advice too. I mean, it's great when you're a speaker. It's the connection with the audience. It's the connection with other people that is so critical before you get to the content. And I think we try to skip that. We try to skip to the content right away, and we forget about the underlying humanity, that underlying factor of content coming after a connection. What is it? What is writing and reading all about? It really is about connections. So many deep connections. So that's it for my reflections. I want to thank Donn for being such a great guest. I want to thank you, dear listener, for listening to the podcast. I want to thank all of those who support this podcast over at patreon.com/starkreflections. Thank you guys so much for your support. What I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and get an extra audio feed into the Patreon feed for you awesome patrons. But if you want to support the show, you can always share the podcast with someone that you think would find value in it. Leave a review over on wherever you listen to podcasts. But as I said, that's it for this episode. So until next week and until next episode, this is Mark Leslie Lefebvre wishing you great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.